When you travel, you're kind of at the mercy of the light as far as your photos go, right? You can't really change that, but you can change how you respond to it. I know it gets kind of confusing, especially in low light. That's one of the questions I get a lot. How do I still make good photos when the light is low? That means at the end of the day, when it's overcast and cloudy, or even at night. Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. How to make beautiful photos even in low light. Hi, welcome back. I'm Diane and this is the PhotoFluent channel. And my goal here is to help you overcome that inner critic, become more creative with your camera, and take photos that you absolutely love when you travel. And if that sounds like something that you're interested in, make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications. Okay, let's jump in to creating photos that you love even in low light. The first tip that I have is to use a tripod. Okay, so maybe you don't want to lug a tripod along when you travel, but stick with me here. The tripod is kind of the easiest way to get out in low light, especially at night. Why it works so well is because it holds your camera steady. Why is that important? Well, when your camera is trying to accommodate for low light, that means you have to maybe have a longer shutter speed. Why? Because as the shutter speed slows down, it lets more light in. So if it's really fast, little tiny light sneaks in, but if it's really slow, then a lot of light comes in. So one option for getting good photos is to slow down your shutter speed. What can happen when you do that is that your camera gets a little shake to it because none of us are really that steady. You know, we're doing things like breathing, moving. So it's hard to hold your camera super steady. Well, if you have a tripod, that holds your camera steady. So it's really fun to play around at night with a tripod. What you can do is leave that shutter speed open for seconds or even minutes and play with light. So you can get everything in super sharp focus, except the things that are moving, like people or this carousel I took a photo of in Toulouse, or just the night lights, like this photo in Bordeaux. So it's fun to play with a tripod. You can get some really interesting photos at night or at low light. However, that means you have to carry it along with you when you travel. So let me know in the comments, when you travel, do you carry a tripod with you? Now, if you're not a fan of carrying a lot of stuff, like I'm not, that leads to my second tip, and that is turn up the ISO. Okay, so what is ISO exactly? Well, ISO just changes the brightness of your photos. So a lower number like 100 or 200 means it's really bright outside and you're going to get enough light in your camera. But if the light goes down and gets low, you turn up the ISO and that increases the brightness of your photo. Now, the thing with ISO is, how much do you turn up the ISO? Well, it depends, because ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, they all kind of play together. Now, if that gets a little confusing, and I know it can, make sure you check out my video of how to get out of auto mode. I go into a little bit more detail about the settings and how they relate to each other. Of course, I will link to that in the description. Now let's get back to ISO. So ISO is just a number that ranges depending on your camera. It usually starts around 50 or 100, and you can go up as high as your camera allows. Now, there is an exchange. You don't just crank up the ISO for free. The higher the ISO, the more the noise or grain in your photo. So you want to increase your ISO with a little bit of caution. Although I personally don't travel a lot with a tripod, so I would rather turn up my ISO, have a little bit of noise, and a lot of that can be taken out later in Lightroom anyway. So here are some examples of my using ISO when I traveled. Here we are at Albi, and this is sunset. We were on our way to dinner, so I didn't want to carry a tripod with me. I'm not sure I even had one on that trip, to be honest. So it's sunset, the light is low, but the scene was gorgeous. So I just turned up my ISO to 1000, and that gave me enough light that I could get the photo that I wanted. Now, here we are again in Albi at the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum, and it's inside, so that makes the light low anyway. So in this one, I had to turn up my ISO to 6400 because it was pretty dark in there. I love to take photos inside museums of people looking at the art. I don't know why. It's just something I enjoy doing. It's fascinating to me to see the art, of course, that's why you're in the museum, but also to watch other people appreciating and observing and seeing the art. Okay, anyway, let's keep going with the ISO. Now, here's another time when the light was low, and it's just because it's overcast. So it's in the middle of the day, but your light is just low naturally because the clouds are blocking the sun. So in this case, this florist is putting out flowers, and it's such a beautiful scene, but I needed to turn up the ISO to about 500 here to get the exposure that I wanted. So if now you're saying, okay, ISO, that sounds great. Well, how much do I turn up the ISO? Well, that again depends on what your aperture is, what your shutter speed is, how much light you have. So a lot of it is trial and error and just trying different ISOs and seeing what you get. I know that's not an answer you always like to hear. You like to see a formula, if this, then that. I know a lot of people have asked me for formulas. In this situation, use these settings, and there really isn't any. I know I see some promoted, you can download, you can buy, but it really depends so much on the setting that what I want you to do is play around to the point that you become comfortable trying different things, different settings, different combinations of settings. So stick with me. I'm going to walk you through how to get there. So give me a like on this video if you would rather turn up your ISO than lug a tripod along with you. That's me. Okay, now we're ready for tip number 3, and that is to lower your f-stop number. Okay, now f-stop equals aperture, right? And aperture determines your depth of field, how much of the photo is in focus. And aperture is also the hole in your lens, and the size of that hole determines the aperture. So when you choose a lower f-stop number, that means a bigger hole in your lens. So say you're at this scene in Carcassonne, where it's a beautiful landscape, and you would more likely choose a higher f-stop number. Why? Because for landscapes, you typically want everything from the foreground to the background in focus. So I might have chosen f18, even f21 or 22, because I wanted everything in focus. But you can see I didn't have really bright light. It's the end of the day. There's lots of clouds. So instead, I chose f8, which is a good kind of neutral aperture number. And it's lower than I might have chosen with all of the light in the world. But because I was limited on light, I chose f8. And I turned up my ISO to 640. That combination gave me what I needed to keep my shutter speed fast enough. I didn't have a tripod, so that I could still handhold it, not need a tripod, and get the shot that I wanted. Now, I don't always just pick the settings, take the shot, and think, perfect. I'll try some settings. Didn't work. I'll try some others. I have a mirrorless, so I can also look at the back of my camera, and it tells me the changes in real time. A DSLR that has a mirror, you have to take the shot and then look at the back of your camera. With a mirrorless, I can change the settings and see what I'm getting before I take the shot. So I try different combinations. It gets easier, it gets more automatic. I have a better guess at the first set of combination of settings. But trust me, you will get there. And again, if all of this is getting confusing, go back to that video about getting out of auto mode, and we're going to talk through more details in the settings and how they relate. And yes, you'll see that link below. Okay, so here's some other things to think about in regards to light. Whether you have bright light or low light or shadows, think about light as a component in your photography. So you can use shadows and silhouettes as an element in your photo. You can use cloudy, dreary days to set the mood of that particular day, because you're photographing your experiences, right? Your moments. So if it's a cloudy, dreary day, it can be ominous, or it can be kind of saturated, dense colors because of all the moisture in the air and the cloud filter that acts between you and the sun. So think about light as not something you're working against or trying to figure out, but embrace it and incorporate it into your photos. And also think about your exposure settings, absolutely, but also how you stand and how you move in relation to the light. Okay, so how does this all make better sense? Well, I'm glad you asked. Get out your camera and practice. It's not the time when you're on a great trip to figure this all out. And I get some feedback from my audience like, oh, well, when I'm traveling, I'll do that class, or I'll get out my camera and practice when I have a trip. But now is the time. You don't want to get that camera out and think, how does this all work? When you're getting ready to go on a fabulous trip the next day or even the next week. If you get your camera out and practice between trips, months before you go on your next big trip, then all of this will be more natural, more automatic, and you'll be confident with your camera settings. So get that camera out, and you know what? Put it in manual mode. I know, a lot of people get freaked out by manual mode, but it's just a setting. It's not going to screw up your camera. You might take some really bad photos, and that's okay. That's how you learn. So get your camera out, put it in manual mode, and then as the sun goes down in the evening, or even at night when it's really dark, take that camera out and try some different settings, different combinations of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and just see what you get. It's really fun to play at night with the light, like in a city. When I lived in Denver, we used to go downtown and take photos of the traffic on the highway or the light rail kind of swishing through. It's just fun to try slow shutter speeds, fast shutter speeds, with a tripod, without. See what you get. That is how you'll learn to play. And also that's how you'll get more confident with your camera. That's the goal, so that you're confident and you know when I go on that trip, I am going to come back with some amazing photos. Now, if you want some more inspiration and motivation to get that camera out before your next trip, make sure you watch my video, 5 photo tips that every traveler should know. And you should be able to click on it right now and start watching right away. Okay, that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on your notifications, and I will see you next time.